Let's talk about depression. So depression, and specifically manic depressive disorder, affects about 5% of the global population, or according to a study in 2018 by Hassim, about 10% of the US population. So it's clearly quite a big deal right now. Like, it's at epidemic proportions across the US, and the trend shows that depression is rising. So more people are getting depressed. And you might be feeling those symptoms of depression. So with that in mind, I thought we'd go over in this video the symptoms of depression and different kinds of depression, so you can know for certain whether you are depressed, how severe that depression might be, why that depression might be happening, and so how you can go about curing it. So with that in mind, I thought I'd make this video to basically go over the symptoms of depression and different kinds of depression and different causes of depression. So if you're feeling these things, you can kind of make sense of your emotions. Maybe you've been feeling a certain kind of way for the past while and you don't know if it is depression, or maybe it's something else. You don't know what exactly is causing it. Hopefully this video will be able to shed some light onto the symptoms of depression and the causes of it. And then maybe you can use that kind of self-awareness to decide if you want to go and see a doctor if you think those symptoms of depression are major enough. But we're also going to have some tips for people that think they have mild depression or like a kind of mood disorder and want to try and fix that. So the definition of depression comes from the DSM-5, which is a diagnostic manual used in psychology, well, basically to diagnose mental disorders. And it has a list of symptoms that are common in depression. And basically the idea is that if you have 5 or more of these symptoms that you experience nearly every day in the past 2 weeks, then you probably, or you might have clinical depression and should probably go and see a practitioner. So let's go through them. The first one is quite obvious. It's a depressed mood. And that relates to feelings of sadness, emptiness, hopelessness every day or most of the day for the past 2 weeks. This is quite a subjective one. And you either know if you experience it or you don't. But basically, have you been feeling sadder recently? Maybe your threshold for crying has reduced recently. Maybe you're crying more. That's actually quite a valid sign of depression. Maybe you're feeling feelings of sadness, emptiness, hopelessness. All these feelings are associated with depression. So then the next symptom is called anhedonia. And if you know what hedonism means, then you'll understand that this basically means a reduction or a lack of pleasure from certain activities that maybe you used to find pleasurable and don't anymore, or for activities that you should normally find pleasurable. So that's things like eating food, exercising, walking, social interactions. Are you gaining pleasure from these things anymore? If you don't gain pleasure from them, then you might be depressed. And then the next symptom is guilt. And it's a less so spoken about symptom, but it's quite common inside of depression that individuals will feel symptoms of guilt towards their disease. That they'll feel almost guilty about having it. And that will lead to maybe thoughts of self-hatred, which in their most extreme forms can lead to suicidal ideation and self-harm. So if you feel thoughts of guilt, maybe you're depressed. And then very much so linked to that, we have those thoughts of suicidal ideation, which are probably the most commonly thought of symptoms of depression, and obviously the most tragic. But if you're having thoughts of suicide, or if you're having suicidal ideation, and not just thoughts of death, but thoughts of suicide, then you should definitely go and speak to a general practitioner. So other than those though, we have another set of symptoms which are what we call vegetative symptoms, or symptoms that are affected by the autonomic nervous system. Because this is a part of depression that isn't talked about a lot. A lot of people just see depression as, okay, it's sadness, it's emotional, it's these kind of subjective feelings, but there are general physiological changes that happen in the depressed person's mind. The first one of those, for example, is weight loss, and that's characterized by a weight change of more or less than 5% of your kind of weight beforehand, without things like dieting and exercise. So if you're not on a diet or you're not exercising and you lose more or gain more than 5% of your current body weight, then that could be a sign of depression. Again, the problem with these vegetative kind of symptoms are they can also be issues with many, many other things. Weight gain or loss is symptomatic of a lot of things, but if you can combine it with some of the other symptoms, then it could be a cause of depression. And then next is insomnia or hypersomnia. Basically, do you find it hard to sleep? Do you sleep too little or do you sleep too long? Very common inside of people with depression is the pattern of waking up very early and not being able to fall back asleep even though you're extremely tired or fatigued. So fatigue and tiredness is another vegetative symptom of depression. But kind of lack of sleep is linked to that, but different as well. It changes the architecture of your sleep too. So usually you have kind of lighter sleep followed by REM sleep, and it switches that around and messes with it. Basically, it really messes with your sleep depression. So if you've been sleeping very badly recently, then again, that could be a vegetative symptom of depression. And then the final vegetative symptom is what we call psychomotor agitation or retardation. And it's basically a reduction in movement or overmovement if you're agitated. But essentially, it's that feeling of not wanting to get out of bed in the morning. If you remember our episode on dopamine, then you'll remember that dopamine has some sort of role to play in movement. People with Parkinson's, for example, have low dopamine in their striatum. And so depression, which is often linked with a reduction in tonic baseline dopamine, can cause that kind of psychomotor retardation, which leads to feelings like not being able to get out of bed. That's a very real symptom. So if you have 5 or more of these symptoms, then I would highly suggest that you go and see a physician or a doctor about these conditions that you have, just to try and make a bit more sense of them than you could over, say, a YouTube video. It's quite important to know these things about yourself because it's quite empowering. I think an issue with depression is so many people get trapped in a mindset of not really believing that they can change. I mean, that is one of the symptoms of depression. It's feelings of hopelessness. And it is very true. I think because depression is a mental disorder and because it's inside of your brain, as opposed to, say, a physical disorder that you can see manifestations of, like a broken leg, people are less likely to believe that it can be changed. It becomes very much part of one's identity. But if you can notice these symptoms in yourself that are very much to do with chemical and biological changes in your body, not just feelings, then you can empower yourself to truly believe that these things can change. You can go to a doctor and they can help alleviate your symptoms. This isn't something you're trapped with for the rest of your life. So yeah, if you experience 5 or more of those symptoms within the last 2 weeks every day, then I would suggest you go to a doctor. But maybe you don't experience those symptoms, or maybe you experience those symptoms a bit less. Maybe you decide you have mild depression. So what can you do in that scenario? Well, to understand that, we need to talk a bit about the causes of depressive symptoms. And these essentially boil down to 3 different categories. And the first of those categories are categories related to epinephrine. So epinephrine, or norepinephrine, which is also called adrenaline and noradrenaline, is a neurotransmitter, a neuromodulator, which is found, it's also a hormone though, which is found in the brain, and it's essentially, it gives you energy. It's the most basic way that we can describe it. But a reduction in norepinephrine levels in the brain is directly linked to a few depressive kind of symptoms. And these are specifically the feelings of psychomotor retardation that we spoke about. So, feelings of lethargy, tiredness, fatigue, the inability to get out of bed in the morning. These things are related to reduction in norepinephrine. So, if you have those symptoms more strongly than others, then this might be the kind of pain point inside of your brain. The next cause of a lot of depressive symptoms is kind of more of a dopaminergic cause. So it's due to low dopamine. And this again can be caused by very physiological reasons, or like we spoke about, can be caused by things like addiction. So an addiction to various things like pornography, like social media, can have very real effects on your dopamine. It can reduce your tonic baseline dopamine levels inside of your body, and those can create huge problems. They create a lot of the kind of anhedonia that's associated with depression, so that feeling of not being able to get pleasure from things, because as the common moniker goes, dopamine is the pleasure hormone. It isn't exactly the pleasure hormone, it's more of the motivation and drive hormone, but hormone neurotransmitter. But yeah, essentially having low dopamine can cause the symptoms of anhedonia inside of depression, but also the symptoms of low motivation too. And then the final category is the sort of serotonergic category. So the ones that are affected by serotonin levels. And low serotonin, we're going to go on to why that's caused. And we're going to talk about that in the next video as well, where we're going to discuss novel treatment of depression. But serotonin-related symptoms are the mood-related symptoms. So those feelings of grief and sadness are directly linked to your serotonin. So why? Why is that useful to know? And basically it's useful to know because if you can notice in yourself that you have more of one specific symptom, then you better know where to target. So if I feel depressed, but I don't have all the symptoms, and say for example I only have symptoms of anhedonia and fatigue, I know that likely it's due to kind of dopaminergic issues and a reduction in epinephrine or norepinephrine in my brain, rather than it is an issue with serotonin. And so I can better target actions that try to help that. I can take cold showers, I can kind of reduce social media use, whatever. Depression can also be caused by an underactive thyroid, and this is the case in 20% of depression. So if you have depression and you don't know exactly why that may be, then taking a blood test, which has different thyroid levels on it, might be a very useful thing to do, especially if you're kind of postpartum right now, so you've just had a kid, or if you're menopausal. Then it's more likely that you might have depression related to an underactive thyroid. And then finally, depression can also be caused by stress, by cortisol in your body. The more bouts of stress that you experience throughout your life generally increases your likelihood of suffering from manic depressive disorder, or at least episodes of MDD. And there are different things. You see, especially if you have a family member who suffers from depression, then it's crucial that you engage in stress management tactics, because there are various hormones, and I've got one written down here. It's called 5-HTT-LPR, which is linked to kind of more susceptibility to stress-induced depression. So if you have a family member that is depressed, then maybe pay attention to your stress levels, because that can be a genuine cause of depression. So again, we have some techniques here that you can reuse to limit your stress or to manage your stress. And the easiest one to do, and probably the most powerful for the most people, is meditation. So meditation, we made a whole video on it, so go and watch that, but it is so powerful in stress reduction. Effectively, its biggest role in stress reduction is that it reduces activity in the amygdala. So the amygdala is part of your brain which responds to external stimuli and assigns values to them. Most commonly, it responds to kind of stresses and fear, and will activate the sympathetic nervous system due to that, so it will release cortisol, for example. The amygdala also modulates the HPA axis. You don't really need to know what that means, but the HPA axis is basically the thing that's responsible for releasing cortisol and adrenaline. And yeah, meditation is very powerful. In fact, in a study by Judson Brewer, it was shown that only 13 minutes of meditation a day has been proven to reduce stress drastically. So if you suffer from a lot of stress and you believe that might be the cause of your depression, then engaging in the practice of meditation every day for 13 minutes is a great way to start to alleviate those symptoms. Like I said, we made a full video on meditation, so go and watch that if you think your depression might be stress related. But also other ways, exercise reduces cortisol levels, and deep breathing does too. So practices like non-sleep deep rest, or just taking deep breaths. The 4-7-8 breathing method, where you take an inhale for 4 seconds, you hold it for 7, then you exhale for 8 seconds and repeat that 4 times. Top-up breaths, or rescue breaths they're sometimes called. Again, all these things can calm you down. Basically, you want to be stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system here. So we spoke about that in our video on optimizing deep rest and also productivity. But yeah, if you're feeling stress a lot of the time, then you need to work on reducing that chronic stress, because chronic stress can be a very real cause of depression. So like we said, if you believe you have major depression, so you suffer from 5 or more of the symptoms we listed, then it could be due to one of those things. And I'd suggest that you go to a doctor and ask them to check your blood, tell them the symptoms that you're experiencing, see if it's related to your thyroid, maybe it's related to cortisol hormone, maybe it has quite an easy fix like that, obviously not an easy fix, but anyway, or maybe it's related to something else, and your doctor will be able to help you work through those different things. But if you don't have all of those symptoms, maybe you only have a few, what practices can you start to put into your life that will help that? And like we spoke about, stress reduction. Stress reduction is a big one. We just went over it though. So next is meditation. And this is useful even if you're not stressed. So we spoke about it in regards to stress relief. But also a big thing that it does is it reduces your DMN activities. Your DMN activity is called your default mode network. And it's basically the part of your brain that's active when you're not doing anything. So if you were to turn your phone off right now and just sit there, you'd start thinking about things, and that's your default mode network. That's the thing that kind of just runs in the background. It's just churning along when you've got nothing else to do. And there was a very good study on that. It was called The Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind. And what it found, basically, was that individuals who let their minds wander more, who aren't as present in certain tasks, say let your mind wander, it's a bit of a misnomer, but for people that have less presence in activities, that leads to increased depression. It leads to decreased happiness, but they're very similar things. So yeah, one way to increase your happiness quite quickly is by meditating. In only 8 weeks of 30-minute daily meditation, you can start to experience most of these benefits of stress relief and increased happiness. Next is cold showers. So cold exposure has been shown to massively spike epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And that's quite obvious if you know what adrenaline is. When that kind of cold water hits you and your body goes into survival mode, fight or flight mode, it pumps adrenaline through your body. And if you remember what we spoke about before, adrenaline or lack of adrenaline in the brain can be a major cause of depression. It also increases dopamine. So if, for example, the symptoms you're suffering from are those symptoms that we talked about, are feelings of fatigue, psychomotor retardation, but also feelings of anhedonia, then cold showers could be a fantastic way to start to combat those feelings of depression. They increase your dopamine levels for quite a long time throughout the day, for up to 2 to 3 hours after cold water exposure. They don't also dip them as far as other things do, like drugs. And yeah, it releases norepinephrine. And then related to that, and very, very important if you suffer from depression or think you might suffer from depression, is cessation of dopaminergic activities. And what do I mean by that? Well, basically I mean stopping things that give you excess dopamine, like nicotine, like drugs, like pornography, like social media. All these things are going to do is exacerbate your symptoms of depression by causing you even more dopamine imbalance. Like we spoke about, when you're consistently exposed to phasic dopamine releases from things like pornography, for example, which spike your baseline tonic dopamine 2 times above its baseline, your body compensates by releasing less tonic dopamine, and that is directly linked to feelings of depression. So, basically what that means in English is quit porn, quit social media, quit smoking. Nicotine is also very bad for it, it's 2.5 times above your baseline. Quit these things that are dopaminergic because it will cause you more happiness in the long run. You'll be able to gain more happiness from more normal things and from your brain by itself. And then finally, exercise releases a lot of serotonin. So if you think you suffer from the kind of serotonergic symptoms, like low mood or feelings of grief or sadness, then you might want to try exercising, going on a run. We're also going to speak about exercise in our next video on novel treatments for depression because it has a lot of implications there as well that are very interesting. The problem though with a lot of those things, and what you might be thinking if you have depression, is, well, I'm too fucking depressed to do them. I feel like shit. And that is true. And it's a very unfortunate and quite morbid part of depression, that when you experience those kind of symptoms, they very strongly correlate with not having enough motivation to actually go on and do these things that make you better. And there's not much I can say. I can tell you that these things will help you, but it is up to you to make the decision to actually implement them. And if your depression is that bad, then I really strongly urge you to go and see a doctor that might be able to help you further in this pursuit. So anyway, thanks for watching that video. And if you're interested in the kind of novel treatments of depression, definitely stay tuned tomorrow for our video on that. But yeah, thanks for watching the video. If you gained any value from it, drop a subscribe. And I'm so proud of you, brother. You've got this. Manifest excellence. See you tomorrow.